Hello everybody, how's it going today? Glowplasma 231 here, back again today to talk about World Trigger, chapter number 245. This chapter is titled Rokuro Wakamura. And I made a prediction at the very tail end of last video. I'll play the clip here real fast. Great chapter of World Trigger. Again, this was chapter number 244, titled The Away Mission Test Part 40. And yeah, I'll see you guys next time for chapter number 245, most likely titled The Away Mission Test Part 41. But if it isn't, I'll be decently surprised. I will be more decently surprised. I will be super happy with my life. But as you just heard, I said that I would be extremely happy with my life if the next chapter wasn't titled The Away Mission Test Part 41. And this chapter isn't titled that whatsoever, so that means that I'm extremely happy about my life. I'm always positive whenever I'm talking about World Trigger because I find this to be such an interesting and amazing series that how can I be upset with talking about the greatness that we get here? And I have to say, this chapter is a very, very good one because, of course, as what happened last time in World Trigger was we got a little bit of an interesting thing going through a few more of the squads on the away mission test, pretty much seeing what all of the provisional squads were up to. We got a little bit with Suwa Squad 7 in the beginning where pretty much Suwa was talking to his team about why they shouldn't go and aim to get the lead in these next day of the battle simulations. And pretty much they just talked about that. We went through a few other squads. We hit up Ninamiya's Squad 8 where we learned some stuff that that Emma will be the one who's coming up with strategies for the second day of these Trine Soldier battle simulations. We stopped by Mizukami's Squad 9 and also Kitazoe's Squad 4, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, Kitazoe's Squad 4. And we ended up again with Wakamura's Squad 11, where we pretty much learned that Hyuse is very good at doing Tryon engineering, which was a pretty cool little joke. At the very end of the chapter, well, there's a little bit of that was built up to it, but we eventually got the whole idea that Wakamura asks Hyuse, hey, what does Mikumo have that I don't? And that's where we ended off last chapter, and I really don't think there's any reason for me to delay the inevitable, so I just say we go and hop into this chapter of World Trigger. I probably should say just a few things before I start it. Number one, this month we got a 21-page chapter, which isn't as big as some of the recent chapters have been. I mean, for instance, last chapter was 27 pages. I think the one before that was 23, if I'm not mistaken. So a bit of a shorter chapter this week, but the chapter really ends off on a sort of perfect note for what this chapter is trying to get across. And of course, this was our singular chapter for September of 2024, which means that we have now had 3 months of continuous World Trigger chapters, which I never complain about. That's just awesome to have, and I'm thankful that Ashihara is feeling good enough to be able to provide us with these awesome chapters. But now let's actually hop into the chapter and sort of get on to what we want to talk about, which is Hyuse botting Wakamura as he does in this chapter, right? So we open up the chapter, and of course, Wakamura had just said his famous line of, hey, what does Mikumo have that I don't? And Hyuse pretty much just starts off saying hey, what does Osamu have that you don't? Well, firstly, do you two have anything in common besides you guys both have glasses? And I love that in this shot, we can't see Wakamura's eyes through his glasses that are sort of a little too opaque. It's a pretty funny visual that we get here. And Wakamura sort of stays silent while he hears this. And of course, Hanazaki, who is part of the squad, is also here, of course, with that sort of spiky, showered up bedhead, sort of what I'm going to call it. Or he just has his hat off, which, dude, you need to learn how to use a comb if that's just what your hair looks like. But either way, Hanazaki is just hey, where are you trying to get this question? Where is it coming from, Rokuro? And Wakamura is just well, I mean, and he sort of just thinks to himself internally, crap, why did I have to ask that out loud? I wasn't planning on doing it, and I sort of just blurted it out before I could think, come on, why did I have to do this? And in sort of the present to the rest of his squad, he pretty much says, I mean, it's not really important. And as he says this, he starts to think to himself again, he's like hell, this isn't important. My instincts are telling me this could be the key to everything, the key for changing me to the better. And at this point, after sort of thinking over this, Wakamura just says hey, sorry, let me rephrase that. As he looks at Hyuse and just says hey, Hyuse, you claim that Mikumo doesn't have any natural talent, and that he doesn't have a superior training environment either. Yet shortly after his debut, his squad reached 2nd place in B rank, which is an accomplishment. I totally get why Wakamura is like, hey, why is all of this going on? How has Mikumo done all of this? Because, yeah, he just continues on saying like, hey, I was competing in B rank for over half a year before Mikumo even started, but he was able to whiz past me like it was nothing. So what does he have that I don't? He pretty much just finishes off rephrasing that initial question once again, and Hyuse just says like, oh, okay, I understand the question now. Going sort of back to that natural talent element I mentioned earlier, it's undeniably true that you surpass Osamu in that respect. Because, I mean, Trigger, or Tryon, what am I trying to say? Tryon capacity is the biggest sort of factor in this sort of trigger-based combat. As we get in our scene of just understanding the Tryon differences between Wakamura and Osamu, and of course we've sort of seen like a relatively ranked here. Osamu has a Tryon level of 2, and that Wakamura has a Tryon level of 6. So, of course, one of them is better at trigger fighting than the other is, right? Hyuse just continues on saying like, hey, and that's a fixed in place thing that can't change. On the other hand, you just brought up the relative achievements between squads. As we take a look at the B-Work rankings, and of course, on Wakamura's squad, there of course is him, Katori, and Miura, and there are 3 people and they're at 11th place, and on Osamu's squad, there's of course him, Yuma, Chika, and Hyuse, who've made it all the way up to 2nd place. On top of there being sort of a numbers disadvantage here, which I think is something to bring up, Hyuse just pretty much continues on saying like, hey, simply put, Tamakoma 2 is a superior squad. Are you dissatisfied with this conclusion? I imagine he says this in like a very like a blank, monotone way, because he isn't really giving us much emotion right now, sort of saying like, hey, are you dissatisfied with that conclusion, Wakamura? And the way he just says it, like the tone I imagine Hyuse says this in, is just one of like nonchalantness almost, if you get what I'm saying. But Wakamura just is like, no, like, I mean, what you're saying is clearly obvious from the results alone. Like, how can our squad be 11th, or not 11th? Are they 11th? They are 11th. Golly, I didn't realize they were that low. And then 2nd, like, that is a difference of 9 whole spots. So Wakamura's like, I'm not surprised by that in the slightest. But what he says is pretty much like, hey, I guess what I'm trying to ask you is, what if I had taken Mikumo's place on Tamakoma 2? Like, I'm not confident that the squad would have reached rank 2 with me instead of him as the leader. Or the other way around, what if Mikumo were on Katori's squad? I have a feeling that they would have ended up ranking higher than 11th. And Hyuse sort of sits there in silence for a moment, and eventually just says like, I mean, you're not wrong, that is most likely the case. And I love the next scene here, because we cut over to both Hanazaki and Sasamori, who are also just sitting in here, and we just see like they both combined think just like, ouch, like Hyuse is just brutally honest here, because I mean, he isn't lying. I mean, that's sort of what's going on. I'm sorry, there's a lot of loud car noises in the back. I've got to go close my window real fast and we can talk about more World Trigger, but golly, just hearing cars almost like racing outside my window, let me go fix that real fast. Alright, and we are back. The window is now firmly shut, so I can no longer hear cars almost racing back and forth. And also the AC unit is on the lowest setting, so I don't die from heat in here. So hopefully that'll be nice. But where was I? Yes, Sasamori and Hanazaki are pretty much just sitting here, and they're like, golly, Hyuse is just brutally honest with that guy. It's just a very funny scene, right? But at this point, we just cut back to the conversation between both Wakamura and Hyuse, as Wakamura is just like, I mean, even so with Osamu's low Tryon capacity, he somehow has the power to lead his squad to victory. And I guess what I'm really asking is what that power is exactly. As we pretty much see Hyuse is sitting here, and he's like, alright, and he pretty much leans back in his chair, crosses his arms and sort of just leans back and looks towards the sky. And we sort of see that he's in this position for a few panels, as we pretty much see that Sasamori, who is really just our like comic relief character in this chapter, as we'll see, he does a few things later that are just really, really funny towards him being that sort of comic in a way. But Hanazaki sort of just like is like, man, Hyuse's like really deep in thought here. As he looks over to him and he eventually turns to Rokuro and just says like, hey, Rokuro, so have you been like viewing Mikumo as your rival all along or something like that? And Wakamura just says like, I mean, I wouldn't necessarily call him a rival. Let me also turn down my Discord pings. That would be decently nice. Okay, yeah, Wakamura just says like, hey, I wouldn't exactly call him like my rival or anything. And rather like keep this in mind, this is sort of just like an idea I just suddenly came up with in my head, right? And he's like, I guess I always thought of Mikumo being one of us. And like, one of us, but whatever. Sasamori's in just like, one of us, like, who is us? Like, us who? And Wakamura just says like, well, you know how some people sort of just like wing it, like no training, no studying, and they can still earn an A in a class? And he sort of thinks to Kotori for this example, being that, yeah, the captain on his squad is sort of a bad example for what he's trying to get across here. And he's like Yoko on my squad. Hanazaki's like, yeah, I mean, sure, like people who have skills from the get-go. And Wakamura pretty much says like, well, we all know that Mikumo obviously isn't like that. And he says, like me, he's the hard-working type who trains diligently, or that was at least my impression of him, right? And he pretty much just continues, or no, he doesn't continue, my bad. Hanazaki pipes up and just says like, hey, so what you're saying is like, since Mikumo is like you, is ranking up in achievements, you thought that he must have had some sort of secret angle that he was working. Is that sort of it? And Wakamura's like, I mean, I guess you could put it that way, but it's like, I wouldn't quite also think of it like that. But at this point, Hyuse sort of bumps back into the conversation, as he pretty much just like says like, well, I mean, you say hardworking and diligent, but what sort of training do you get up to, Rokuro? And Wakamura's like, well, I mean, I set up targets in the training chamber, and at this point, Sasumori says, hey, I mean, that's the training that you learn to do with Inukai, right? And Wakamura's like, I mean, yeah, that's how I learned it. And Hyuse thinks, Inukai? Okay. Would you mind going into, like, the specifics of this training? And Wakamura pretty much just explains that, like, twice a week, he is allowed to use the Ninamiya squad training chamber, and he's able to use it for 2 hours a week. During each 2-hour session, we chat about the last few rank war matches while I learned the basics of shooting. As we see a small panel here of just Wakamura sitting down, sort of like shooting his gun at these targets, of course, these Triad targets that we all know and love, and Inukai pretty much standing behind him, pretty much just walking him and giving him a few pointers as time goes on, right? And Hanazaki just says like, oh, so I guess you learned insider tips and tricks for gunners and all of that sort of deal? But Wakamura says like, I mean, not particularly. I mean, the training itself, he was like, just do your own thing. I'll just be here to supervise you. And he pretty much says that Inukai would only step in to correct a few mistakes now and then. And he pretty much continues saying like, hey, but still me and Inukai would chat about all sorts of topics during each session. So I'd like to think I had learned a decent amount in that sense. And Hyuse is like, how long have you been doing this? How long have you been learning from Inukai? And Wakamura just says, I mean, I only started a little over half a year ago, which means that from what the information we got earlier, being that Wakamura has been participating in the B-Rank Wars for about 1.5 years at this point, or 1.5 years before Osamu joined. And I forget how long the rank war matches actually are. I think it's like a season, but I don't remember how long a season is. I feel like it's 8 or 10 weeks. And then, yeah, I just don't remember that specific. I can go reread over World Triggers in my future at some point. I mean, it's always in the future, just as how close into the future is it? I bet Gene could figure that out with his side effect. I haven't said Gene's name in, like, any of these reviews recently, because he just doesn't exist in this series anymore, I guess. That's weird. Bring back Gene. Bring back Gene. Bring back Gene. One of us. But whatever. Wakamura just says that he only started training a little over half a year ago, which I guess would be maybe about 3 months before Osamu and everything in this series sort of started happening with the rank wars and all of that stuff, like yada yada, right? Well, of course, Hyuse hears this, is like, okay, well, tell me, Rokuro, in that time, what have you gained? And Wakamura is just like, like what I've gained is like, I mean, shooting skills and the knowledge of one of the elites. And Hyuse just says, oh, okay, I see. After this conversation, I have a decent understanding of the difference between you and Osamu. But I'm not particularly inclined to explain it to you. And Wakamura's like, hey, wait, why not? Why don't you feel like explaining this to me? Like, isn't that like the whole reason I asked you the question? Like, why can't you help me out here? And he's like, why is all this going on? Hyuse just says like, hey, just 3 reasons. Number 1, you're unlikely to gain anything from hearing my explanation. 2, I fear that hearing what I have to say will cause physical and psychological damage and thereby will negatively affect your performance during this selection exam. And he's like, 3, it may invalidate the training you've done with Inukai up to this point. And throughout all of these, we just see like Wakamura's like sort of taking these hits onto his bodies. We see like a little bit of a comic panel of like a heart in the background, but it's all cracked, and we see that sort of Wakamura is doubled over, sort of hearing the words that Hyuse is saying to him. And also during this time, we see that Hanazaki, being the comic man he is during this chapter, is like, golly, how brutal could this one guy's breakdown be? Like, what's going on here? I also like the fact that Sasumori also has like a bead of sweat dripping off of his face while he hears this. Well, Wakamura then just like pipes up after Hyuse pretty much just like says these 3 things like, hey, you're not going to gain anything, it's going to invalidate your training of Inukai, and also it'll cause you some psychological damage, and that's not a good thing. But mainly what Wakamura focuses on is like, my time with Inukai, how would what you would tell me invalidate what he's taught me? And Hyuse just says like, hey, you are Inukai's disciple. Before giving my explanation, I would need to consult with him first. As all of a sudden, we cut over to Kakizaki's Squad 3, where we see that Inukai is on the phone with, of course, Inukai, the man himself. As Inukai is just like, oh, so is that like the simple reason why you're just like reaching out to me? Like, how awfully polite of you to do this. And we pretty much now just see on the other side of the phone call, we see that both Hyuse and Hanazaki are in the double bedroom, and which I guess is the first time Hyuse has been in this double bedroom because he can't sleep in there because he's a Canadian. Whatever, it's just a really stupidly funny joke. I don't know why it's so funny, but it just is to me. Who really knows, right? But we also get a little note of that Hanazaki came to be on this conversation with Inukai and Hyuse just in case communication wasn't possible over the phone, because of course we know that with Hyuse's Tryon horns and all of that sort of stuff, it can sometimes be a little hard for him to figure out all of this stuff with language and Japanese and all of that. But Hanazaki's also in this room. It'll not really be too important, but he's also here. But pretty much Inukai just says to your phone like, so Hyuse, you're saying that you realized the point behind my training of Wakamura, and Hyuse just says like, I actually do because I underwent similar training. And of course, he went under similar training in After Couture, not the same way that Inukai is doing his training, but he pretty much knows the basics of what he's getting at, right? As Hyuse pretty much just says like, hey, by making conversation and questioning him during standard training sessions, you're trying to get him accustomed to splitting his attention between multiple things during a battle. In the hope that when he faces an enemy in combat, he will be able to track the movement of additional enemies on the battlefield, right? And he pretty much just says like, hey, it is a very particularly effective and meaningful training approach for a mid-range gunner who needs control of the flow of battle, right? And Inukai's like, yeah, I mean, you're completely correct here. And in this panel, we also see that, of course, sitting with Inukai is Inukai's foil, who is Kagira. Kagira is also here listening to this entire conversation, so I pretty much like how we have this sort of like dual setup. I mean, I sort of love how Inukai and Kagira are rivals, so I love that sort of both of them are in on this conversation with Hyuse and Sasumori, or not Sasumori, Hanazaki, my bad. Hanazaki has the white hair, Sasumori has the black hair. I know these character names. I've talked about Wakamura Squad enough to where I should. But we just see Kagura's here, and I don't remember if he particularly has the line, but we sort of just see that he is sitting here. As, where was I in the page? All right, here we are. Hyuse then just says, like, hey, so my question for you, Inukai, is why would you do this for half a year without revealing this fundamental truth to Rokuro? And he says, I mean, if you had some particular reason, then I shouldn't divulge the truth to him of my own accord. And Inukai is just like, damn, like, you're really polite, Hyuse. Like, you're actually respecting me coming to all of this. He's like, yeah, that's pretty nice. But he eventually just says, like, hey, the thing is, I never explained all of that to Rokuro because I wanted him to realize that of his own power and potential first. What he needs most is to start thinking for himself. And Hanazaki's like, oh, so he needs to think for himself. Interesting. And Inukai sort of just continues at this point, just saying, like, hey, there should be, like, a solid balance between thinking for oneself and also seeking outside knowledge. And as of now, Rokuro tends majorly towards the latter. Oh, he's pretty much saying that instead of thinking for himself, Rokuro mainly just tries to seek for all of this outside knowledge. And he pretty much just continues saying, like, hey, like, don't get me wrong, it's great to look to others for advice, but Rokuro lacks the capacity to mull over that advice and digest it. As we sort of just see a little panel of Wakamura interviewing Arashiyama, pretty much getting a few tips and tricks from him as time goes on. And at this point, Hanazaki sort of just, like, pipes up, sort of just, like, being the one, like, hey, I'm also a little dumb. Can you explain this to me, Inukai? And pretty much just asks, like, so you're talking about capacity. Like, how does that, like, work exactly? And Inukai just says, like, hey, think of it simply this way. Since Wakamura has never grown a plant, he can't envision a seed and a bud, and even if somebody gives him a flower, right? So pretty much, like, giving the idea of, like, hey, being that you don't have the knowledge of how something works, you cannot envision the beginning steps of how something were to occur, I think is pretty much what Inukai is trying to get across here. And Hanazaki's like, ooh, look at that, a fancy metaphor. I feel smarter already. But Hyuse then just says, like, hey, so tell me this, Inukai. Is what you were trying to do, it was to get Rokuro to cultivate his own flower from scratch in this sense? And Inukai's like, precisely. I would have been thrilled if he could have, I'd be thrilled if he could think this over and realize the hidden purpose of our training, or get creative with the targets in the training chamber, or even come up with and suggest a totally different training routine. Really, anything. I intended to wait it out until Rokuro used his own head and took some action in some particular way. And Hanazaki's like, hang on, like, that's an insanely roundabout way to do it. Like, why not just say, like, think for yourself and be done with it? And Inukai's like, well, that's like the slippery slope you get into. If I told Wakamura to think for himself, he'd see that as advice and puzzle and start pondering the correct answer to what he thinks I want to hear. Like, that's just the guy's questioning personality. And Hyuse is like, I mean, exactly, like, there's never, like, a correct answer. He's like, I see. And he's like, given that you've put so much thought into this, Inukai, I believe it's best if I refrain from offering Rokuro any answers, or advice of my own. And Inukai's like, no, like, don't do that at all. Like, don't hold back. Like, I was planning to tell him anything and everything if he makes it on to this away mission test. And not to mention, the moment Rokuro chose you during the draft, Hyuse, I got a feeling that he was suddenly thinking for himself a little. And he just says, like, hey, Wakamura has got to accept the consequences of making that choice for himself, even if the answers from you end up bumming him out. And I love this idea that Inukai is pretty much putting down here. As, like, Hyuse is being very respectful and like, hey, Inukai, you have tried to teach Wakamura all of these things, and he really hasn't taken all of this into perspective. But because of the fact that he is also going through and slowly becoming this different person, I'm fine if you tell him everything, Hyuse. It's very, very cool, and I love how much of a cooler character Inukai seems after this chapter. I mean, Inukai's always sort of, like, been, like, that asshole character, and there's been a few better moments about him, but never anything that made me be like, oh yeah, I really like this guy. But after this chapter, I'm really starting to like Inukai a lot more, because we can tell this sort of human side that he has to him, And the way he's going through and putting it is just very interesting, and I do really like Inukai a lot more after this chapter. And honestly, as far as I remember, he's probably one of the most improved World Trigger characters out of this year, which is pretty hard to say because, no, probably Wakamura in the end, because Wakamura has had, like, so much character development this year, but either way, I'm really liking Inukai a whole lot more than before. Well, at this point, after sort of hearing this sort of a whole idea of, like, hey, Wakamura is going to have to accept the consequences of choosing you, Hyuse, even if you say some stuff that really bums him out, Hanazaki's like, everybody's so sure that whatever Hyuse tells Wakamura, that Wakamura is going to be bummed out about this. Like, come on, like, have faith in the guy, which is a pretty funny thing. But Hyuse just says, like, hey, at the end of the day, I can't be 100% sure how Wakamura will be affected by what I'm going to tell him, but this conversation has been very informative, and you have my appreciative thanks. And Inukai is just like, hey, sure thing, Rokuro is in your hands, like, take care of it for me, right? And at this point, we see that they end the phone call between the two of them. There are the two parties between, of course, Inukai and Kagiura, and of course, who's his face? Well, I cannot not remember his name, Hanazaki and Hyuse. And at this point, we sort of stick with Inukai and Kagiura for a few minutes, as Kagiura just sort of, like, gives a very big, like, menacing look over at, Inukai. And Inukai's like, what are you looking at me like that for, Kagiura? And Kagiura is just like, hey, like, I gotta agree with Hanazaki on this one. Like, just teach the kid what he needs to know about all of the roundabout and skip all of the roundabout and cryptic crap. Like, why'd you need to put him through that rigorous training for nothing? Like, aren't you his teacher? Aren't you his sensei? And Inukai's like, hey, no, it's not an option. Because what about whenever I'm gone? And Kagiura sort of has, like, this shocked expressive, like, he's still showing off his jagged teeth, but we can tell that he's not sort of as upset hearing this as he once was. As Inukai just explains, like, hey, the master won't be there to wipe the disciples' butt forever. It's up to the former to help the latter stand on his own 2 feet. Because in combat, we are all alone. And at this point, we cut over to Wakamura Squad 11 again, where we see that Wakamura is sitting in his captain's chair, and we see that he looks completely shocked, bead of sweat rolling down his face, as Hyuse just says, all right, and there you have it, Wakamura, there it is. And we pretty much see that Wakamura has just been told by Hyuse all the stuff going on with his training, everything that Wakamura was aiming for, and all of those ins and out details. We see that he has been informed on all of it. As Wakamura is just sort of sitting there in, like, a stunned silence, as Sasumori, like, looks over to Inukai and just says, like, hey, or not Inukai, Sasumori looks over to Hanazaki and says, like, hey, so is that what Inukai was hoping for the entire time? And Hanazaki's like, I mean, that's what he said, and I don't think he's lying to us. As we just cut to inside Wakamura's mind, as Wakamura is just thinking, damn it, damn it, damn it. And he's like, I never caught on to what he was trying to teach me at all. Not even a little. Like, I wasted half a year with Inukai. He could have taught me so much more if I'd have just paid attention to what he was trying to tell me, as we sort of see that he's beating himself up on the inside. And Hyuse just says, like, hey, surely you've gained something by hearing all of this, haven't you, Wakamura? And Hyuse is like, hey, I don't believe there is a need for me to add anything else. But Wakamura's like, no, hold on. Wait, hold your horses there. He just says, like, with a bit more of a determined grin on his face, and, like, the sweat still running down. Wakamura just says, like, hey, I have come this far, so I can't wimp out and turn my back now. For as much as Inukai wasted his time and effort on me, I need to step up and make good on it. Even a little. Even here. And he pretty much looks around to his squad. We don't see Hisoi at all during this chapter. I take it that's because she is in her operator room writing up her operator report. And this is later on during the day before all of these guys are getting ready to go to bed. But Sasumori and Hanazaki sort of just both look over towards Wakamura, and at the very end here, Hyuse also looks towards Wakamura and says, alright, very well, let me continue then. And it is on this note that we end off this chapter of World Trigger. I love this chapter. Like, I know I say that about almost every single World Trigger chapter, but it is going to be hard to top this chapter at the end of the year. Number one, the first reason I like this chapter a whole lot is because we focus on one singular scene. As the chapter title implies, we focus on Rokuro Wakamura. And while Wakamura may not be the character who's on every single page that this chapter, mainly we keep seeing Hyuse constantly, but it is because that Hyuse is now invested in Wakamura's success as a captain of this provisional squad, and also in his success as a border agent. And seeing Wakamura being told these things, learning about this previous relationship that he has had with Inukai, Inukai's training, and what all of this was going towards, it's only in a way written that I've seen Ashihara write. Because it's such an interesting way. Like, I can see in some other series... Oh, sorry I had to sort of burp there, but... Like, how I would have expected this to go in other series is that Wakamura, or the Wakamura type character, would have just been outright told by the Hyuse character in this sense, right? Like, there wouldn't have been any there wouldn't been of like any like hard telling to him. They would have discovered it on their own after like doing a deep thought. But sort of having Hyuse being so complete and interested in Wakamura's training method to the point where he wanted to talk to Inukai to make sure that he didn't spoil what the whole point of this was. It's just a really brilliant idea that I love how Ashihara wrote it into the series here. And I also like that we only focus on mainly 7 characters in this chapter. Of course, mainly the guys on the, the Wakamura Squad 11, Inukai, Kagiura, and also in spirit, Osamu, being that the whole question is, why is Osamu compared to here? So I really like that. I really like that we stuck with one scene for this entire chapter. And the very end, after, of course, Wakamura has been told all of this, he's pretty much like, hey, I've come out this far, so I can't wimp out now. Like, for as much as Inukai wastes his time and effort on me, I need to step it up here and make good, even a little. Pretty much saying like, hey, teach me more stuff. I need to know how to be better, so continue on your explanation, Hyuse. It is just an amazing moment, not to mention the fact that happened a scene before this, wherever Inukai just says like, hey, he needs to learn how to work on his own, because in combat, we are all alone. It's a lot of really awesome lines that come up. To make this chapter, it's only 21 pages, while it may not be like that bombastic whole chapter we've had recently, where it's like, oh, right, big events are happening, the squad's doing very well, yada yada, we cut around to all of the squad seeing what they're doing. No, it's not like this. This is purely based on making Wakamura a more important and interesting character, and somebody who will be instrumental in Border for years to come. And that is a great way to read this chapter. As for what will happen next time on World Trigger, I'm not really 100% sure. I expected we were going to be staying with Wakamura Squad some more, but I also feel like by the end of next chapter, we will possibly be starting the next day of the Steel and Environment phase, and also moving on towards the, if not starting the next day, also starting the Tron Soldier Special Assignment Day 2 stuff, and moving on from there, because as much as I love this Wakamura character development, it's really all there is to it. Of course, next up is October of 2024. There's no confirmation at this point if we are getting a chapter in October. Of course, I would hope we are, but also we have had, or no, I actually just checked the Viz website, and as far as it is right now, we are having a new chapter coming out on October 3rd of 2024. Of course, it could be delayed or anything if I almost said Wakamura, if Ashihara gets into poor health, which I of course hope that he doesn't, because thank you, Ashihara Sensei, for putting together this amazing series. It's so awesome. But yeah, with that, I really don't have too much else to say. Again, chapter in October, great chapter. Love how Wakamura is getting so built up. And yeah, with that, I really don't have too much else to say. Thank you guys so very much for watching this video. If you did enjoy it, of course, I do plenty of other anime and manga related content on the channel. Talk about other manga series such as Kagurabachi and Oshinoko. and talk about anime series whenever I get around to it. Like, I recently put up a video on my thoughts on Hell's Paradise Shigokuraku episode 8, which actually talked a whole lot about potential, and potential is sort of something that Inukai saw in Wakamura here, so a little bit of a minor tie there. But if you did also enjoy this video, hopefully you'll mind subscribing to the channel down below, and also liking the video. Those are two small things you can do that really just help me out in the long run. And also, leave me a comment down below on what do you guys think about Wakamura's character development and growth here. If you guys would also like to follow me at all or interact, I do have a Discord and a Twitter link down in the description down below. Go check those out. And yeah, with that, I don't really have too much else to say. Thank you guys so very much for watching. This is, of course, World Trigger, chapter number 245, titled Rokuro Wakamura. My day in life have been exalted by how peak this is, but next time I'll be talking about World Trigger, chapter number 246, presumably titled The Away Mission Test, part 41, but also it could be called Rokuro Wakamura 2. So, don't really quite know yet, and don't know what to expect until we get next chapter of World Trigger. So, thank you guys so very much for watching. I had a really fun time filming this one. And yeah, I'll catch you guys next time. This will be Glowplasma 231, signing out.